Hello, everyone, and welcome to Age Better. I'm your host, Barbara Hannah Grufferman, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Jasmeet Hayes, who is an associate professor of cognitive neuroscience at Ohio State University, and she also runs the Mindset Lab there. Now, Dr. Hayes just did some incredible research around midlife and inflammation and stress and its connection to possibly increasing your risk for metabolic syndrome. So we have a lot to talk about, especially that word stress. I really want to get to that word stress and all the things it can do to you. So welcome to Age Better, Dr. Hayes.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
We now know that stress can contribute to inflammation in the body. Lots of studies on that. But your study shows how that inflammation can increase your risk of developing metabolic syndrome. So I want to know, and I think the audience does too, what made you decide to focus on this, especially as it relates to people in midlife?
Yeah, so what's interesting actually is that my interest in this area stems from decades-long work I conducted studying military veterans who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder following their deployment overseas. And so in studying these veterans, I had noticed the relationship between severely traumatic experiences in the war zone and relationships with metabolic syndrome once the soldiers came back home. And so sure enough, when we studied these links, our work in military veterans, we saw that traumatic stress, inflammation, and metabolic syndrome were all intricately linked. And this is particularly important because this all ties back to brain health, something that's extremely important to consider as we age. And so from there, I became intrigued to try and understand, what about stress in everyday life, even outside of the military context? Like you just mentioned, everybody has stress. This is a constant thing that, we just don't get rid of. This is part of the human experience.
Right.
So what about how we, walking through life, how do we perceive stress? And if we perceive that we have a lot of stress in our lives, how does that relate to inflammation and metabolic syndrome? And so in our newest work, that's exactly what we studied.
Please just clarify, what is metabolic syndrome?
Absolutely. Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of symptoms such as high blood sugar, excess body fat around the waist, abnormal cholesterol, that although separately, all of these health indicators are important to consider, but when they occur together, they vastly increase one's risk for things like heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes. And in my own work, we're particularly interested in studying risk for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And so it turns out that metabolic syndrome is a huge risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And I also want to mention that the incidence of Alzheimer's is higher in women, and so it becomes even more important that women consider maintaining metabolic health in midlife. And so changes that happen for women through midlife are extremely important to deal with.
I believe this is the first bit of research that really connects the dots between stress and inflammation and insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. And am I right about that?
Well, first I want to mention that there has been decades of work linking stress to inflammation, inflammation to metabolic syndrome, and stress to metabolic syndrome. Each separate relationship has been discovered, but people sort of just assumed that inflammation was the reason linking stress and metabolic syndrome together. But that actually scientifically wasn't investigated to that point.
Right.
So what's novel in this study is actually measuring all three and finding the evidence for that link.
It's really just incredible. I was very excited when I read this. But please now, let's go into the scientific background. How can stress contribute to inflammation, and then in turn, how can inflammation really contribute to a possible increase in metabolic syndrome? Like, how does that even happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we think what's happening with stress is that it induces a physiological response, which can have a profound impact on physical health. So, with chronic stress, you activate something that we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. And that leads to the secretion of a molecule called cortisol. So, this hormone, even though it's essential for managing acute stress, it can have negative effects when it's persistently elevated. And so, persistently elevated cortisol levels can increase pro inflammatory cytokines, which not only contribute to systemic inflammation, but also to the development of insulin resistance, which is a key factor in metabolic syndrome. And moreover, stress can exacerbate central adiposity, which is a storage of excess fat around the waist, which itself is a risk factor for metabolic syndrome. And that fat tissue around the waist is not inert. It actually secretes inflammatory substances that can further interfere with insulin signaling and metabolism. So you have this sort of vicious cycle of stress relating to inflammation raising risk for these metabolic factors, and the metabolic factors kind of going back and raising inflammation further.
Can you maybe just tell us a little bit about your methodology, like how many people were involved and how did you actually do this, in layman terms?
Right. So we looked at a data set from a national longitudinal study. It's one of the largest national studies looking particularly at health in midlife in the United States. And so we had close to 700 participants in midlife in this study. And so we examined perceived stress. We asked people about their stress. And for example, one of the items is, in the past month, how often have you felt stressed or nervous? And then in addition to that, we examined objective measures of inflammation through blood tests. And
Hmm.
we also measured objective measures of metabolic syndrome using sort of the state of the art approach in which we build a model to look at all of the potential markers of metabolic syndrome, including blood pressure, insulin resistance, cholesterol, BMI or body mass index, waist circumference, and others. And so then we examined separate relationships between stress, inflammation, and metabolic syndrome. And then further, we examined building a model whether inflammation could be an explanatory variable in these relationships between stress and metabolic syndrome.
And turned out that yes, it was, as
Right.
it turned out, yes. And
Yeah.
so we know that a lot of this is based on lifestyle choices that we make. And that's, again, something I always like to convey to the audience that not all of this is in your control, but a lot of it is. But genetics also plays a part. What do you think the ratio is in this whole scenario between lifestyle and genetics? Do we know?
I don't think that we know
Hmm.
exactly, but what I would like to say when people, and I've heard this a lot, that people will say, oh, they're so healthy, that's their good genes, that sort of sentiment. What I'd like for people to know is that although our genes don't change themselves, the way our genes are expressed can absolutely change through lifestyle factors. So, for example, we know that early life stress, smoking, those kinds of lifestyle factors absolutely changes the way our genes are expressed. And so I think the take home really is that, to some extent, genes, they're there, they account for a little bit of the variance that we think about in terms of metabolic syndrome. But lifestyle factors are so key because not only are they important in and of themselves, but they also change the way our genes are expressed. And so I think when people understand that, they will see the benefit to lifestyle
That
factors.
was so well said. So even though you do get the genes that you get, I mean, you get them from your parents, and there
Yeah,
you have it, and
yeah,
that's how you start. But that you can kind of, again, use the word mitigate. We can mitigate some of the risks
Yes.
by taking certain steps with our lifestyle decisions and choices.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this whole field now called
Yes,
epigenetics.
it's so fascinating.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I think that really drives home the point that some of these lifestyle factors are modifiable. They are things under our control that to a large extent that we can do in our everyday lives.
Yeah, and I find that very, very motivating, inspiring, and exciting. And as you pointed out, more and more research is coming out, which is really good news for all of us. So I think this is a great time to segue into, okay, so let's talk about what can we do to lower our risks for, for getting the inflammation that could then turn into a greater risk for metabolic syndrome, and that's starting with stress. So, in one of the many articles I read about this new research of yours, is that you did point out that it's some really low cost ways of dealing with your stress that you are recommending that people really look at very seriously. Let's talk about that. What can people do to mitigate their risks for stress?
Such a key question. So there are so many different ways, cost-effective ways that people can manage stress. And what I would suggest is that everyone try different things and figure out what's the best for them. So for some people, engaging in physical activity is one of the best ways to manage stress. So personally speaking, engaging in activity is absolutely vital for me to manage stress. And it doesn't have to be an expensive gym membership. It could be walking around the neighborhood, just increasing your physical activity. Now, for others, it's finding comfort in spirituality, prayers, social networks. All of those things have shown to reduce stress. Another thing that I'd really like to emphasize is sometimes when people think of stress management techniques, they think of having to take out large chunks of their very busy lives to try and reduce their stress. And it doesn't have to be that way. There's many techniques that you can do along with the tasks that you're doing in everyday life. So for example, when I say the word mindfulness, people usually think of, going into a dark room, closing your eyes,
Right.
taking time out of your day to do that. It doesn't have to be that way. Mindfulness is really about paying attention to what you're doing in the moment. So you don't have to stop your regular activities. You don't have to just focus on, meditation. It could be if you're going, you're taking your dog for a walk or you're walking from one room to the next, just being present and mindful. That is really sort of what that's about. Um, Even deep breathing exercises, for example, you can do that while you're sitting at your desk typing or, at work. You're doing something at work, you can always deep breathe. And that's a really effective form of reducing your sympathetic system and having your body kind of reduce that acute stress. So ultimately, like we were talking about, all of us have stress, and there's really nothing we can do to prevent the difficult things that happen to us. But what's important is finding what works for you, finding your purpose, and finding meaning in what you're doing in your life, and finding others that can go along the journey with you. I think those are all, really important ways to manage stress in your life.
Absolutely. All wonderful, wonderful, doable tips. And I know for me personally, you mentioned first and foremost moving your body. And there is something which I've talked about a lot. I had some experts on discussing with me things like exercise snacks, things that you can do, as you pointed out, throughout the day. And these are all things that really, as you pointed out, contribute to lowering your stress. So what's next for you? What are you going to do with this research and continue with it?
So first, I'd really like to give a shout out to my wonderful lab and graduate students, Savannah Jurgens and Sarah Prieto, who are really driving a lot of the work as well. And so what we're doing as a lab is really following these individuals longitudinally to see what kinds of stressors are the ones that people may want to manage the most. So, for example, I have a student who's very interested in looking at discrimination, stress. And, as women, we face discrimination. People from underrepresented backgrounds face discrimination. How does discrimination, stress impact inflammation, metabolic syndrome? And then also,
That's
those,
fascinating.
yeah, those modifiable factors. What factors are kind of give you the most bang for your buck in reducing metabolic syndrome and reducing risk for Alzheimer's disease? So we actually have, several studies ongoing in the lab where we're following people and characterizing them over time to try and figure out the risk and resilience factors.
Oh, really wonderful. So I know you'll be back on the show to talk about your future research, and it's so nice that you mentioned your colleagues, your graduate students. I know they were also referenced in some of the articles that I read about this research, and really applaud to all of you at the Mindset Lab. So, Dr. Hayes, this was really incredible. Could you just give our audience your top three take, or however many you'd like to share, takeaways from our conversation today?
Absolutely. First and foremost, I want people to know that mental health has physiological and biological consequences. So don't ignore it. I think, a lot of times people think, oh, well, it's just in your head. Well, yes, it's in your head, but biologically, it's in your head. It makes a huge impact. So really getting to know yourself, getting to know your mental health states is so important. Um, I think another key takeaway is that our lifestyle choices, and we've talked, about this quite a bit, are extremely important in maintaining health through midlife and older adulthood. So, again, I've heard people say, oh, well, that person has good genes, but what I want to impress that what makes the most difference are those lifestyle factors. And then third, what I'd like to kind of, have people think about is that it's never too late to enact healthy lifestyle choices. Midlife is a great time for this. Older adulthood is a great time for this, to reduce stress, to eat well, to sleep, get physically active, spend time with people. I think everybody is doing the best that they can given the circumstances that they're in. But can you just make small tweaks to your lifestyle? Like you mentioned, small breaks throughout the day. Doesn't have to be big or dramatic. We know that even those small changes that someone can make can improve our life by a great amount. So those are, I think, the key takeaways that we've had through all of our research.
And those are great takeaways. And of course, I agree with all of them. And you said one of my favorite words, to tweak. I'm a big believer, and I urge people to do this all the time, to assess, to reassess where you are, because we're changing. What's working for me now at 67, I'm different than when I was 50, when I first started really focusing on my health and well-being as I was getting older. So, periodically I'll reassess where I am, what I'm eating, how I'm sleeping, how I'm moving my body, how often, so on and so forth. And then I'll tweak accordingly. And I do that, fairly frequently. If I feel something's off, if something's not working right, or if my health check numbers aren't where they should be, I tweak. Very often in conjunction and partnership with my healthcare providers. Thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate the time. I know how busy you are.
Absolutely. This is such a pleasure.
Thank you.